The Cold War was the period of great tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, which lasted from 1945 until the fall of the Soviet Union, or USSR, in 1991. The greatest fear of the Cold War period was that tensions between the two superpowers would become so great that the war between the two rival nations would turn hot and lead to a nuclear exchange that would end human civilization. Please like and subscribe to our growing channel to see more videos like this. We're about to tell you about some of the secret experiments and plans carried out by the United States during the Cold War. But before we do that, we'd like to tell you exactly how close the world came to destruction in the Cold War era. There were several instances when the USA threatened or hinted at the use of nuclear weapons. But these threats involved another world power, Communist China, and involved the Korean War and China's actions toward the government of the Nationalist Chinese and a U.S. ally in the 1950s. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, U.S. President Kennedy announced an American naval blockade around the island of Cuba to prevent the Russians from installing additional nuclear missiles there. Tensions got so high that Kennedy warned the Soviets that it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Tensions remained high for days, until the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in return for the removal of the blockade and the non-publicized removal of U.S. missiles from the territory of its NATO partner, Turkey, which bordered the USSR. In 1983, the world came even closer to nuclear war when miscommunication, misinterpretation, and mistrust combined to put the nuclear branch of the Soviet armed forces on full alert. The United States elected Ronald Reagan president in 1981. One of the main pillars of his platform was challenging the Soviet Union worldwide. Part of this included modernization and the increase of the American nuclear missile force, most notably the placing of Minuteman medium-range nuclear missiles in Europe. When deployed, these missiles could strike targets inside the Soviet Union in a few minutes, effectively negating the Soviets' nuclear capability. Combined with Reagan's rhetoric in which he called the Soviet Union the evil empire, and was heard, during a microphone check before a radio address, joking that he had ordered a missile strike on Moscow, the Soviets' usual paranoia was elevated to new levels. Despite statements by Reagan and members of his administration that the United States would never start a nuclear war, the Soviets remained very wary of Reagan. This combined to lead the Soviets to contemplate a nuclear first strike when the U.S. announced the military exercise called Able Archer 83 that year. The most significant and crucial part of the Able Archer exercise was American nuclear troops practicing the field deployment of the same nuclear missiles the USSR was so worried about. In addition, increased communications between the USA and the United Kingdom also worried Soviet high command. During the exercise, the Red Army officer in charge of declaring a nuclear emergency saw a total of 5 unusual blips on his new radar screen, which indicated a nuclear launch by the United States. Luckily, this officer, having trained on and having experience with this new Soviet early warning system, decided that the warnings were false. The system had glitches that were still being worked on. Besides, an American nuclear attack would not involve 2 attacks of 1, then 4 missiles. Instead, they would include hundreds, if not thousands of U.S. missiles. That simply, nuclear war was averted. Though it falls outside the Cold War era, another Russian miscue almost led to the launch of that country's nuclear arsenal. On January 25, 1995, American and Norwegian scientists in Norway launched a rocket to take scientific readings in the atmosphere. The fear of an accidental nuclear exchange called for all orbital launches to be reported to the other side. This was done, but somewhere along the Russian chain of command, the message got lost and never reached those in charge of the Soviets' nuclear forces. When the Russians picked up the launch, it was at approximately the same altitude and trajectory that an American Trident nuclear missile would take on its way to the USSR. With only minutes to react if the missile was a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, Russian generals brought the nuclear briefcase to President Boris Yeltsin. They strongly suggested he order a full retaliatory Russian nuclear strike. Yeltsin, who was frequently drunk, was luckily sober and sober-minded and decided that his generals were wrong. He refused to order the launch. Soon after, Russian observers reported that the missile had changed its trajectory and fell on Norwegian territory less than a half hour after it was launched. In 1962, the movie The Manchurian Candidate was released. It was based on the 1959 book of the same name, which described a fictional American presidential candidate who had been a prisoner of the Chinese during the Korean War. In the book, this character is brainwashed through the use of chemicals and hypnosis to become an unwitting agent of the communists, and almost becomes president of the United States until he commits suicide, having discovered his secret purpose. Truth is stranger than fiction. It's true that the Soviet Union did use psychoactive drugs and hypnosis on some of its political prisoners during the Cold War, in an effort to either completely debilitate them, divulge secrets about Soviet dissidents, or cause them to publicly admit the error of their ways. What you might not know is that the United States conducted its own experiments with chemicals and drugs to discover if there was a way to either debilitate large segments of a hostile population or control the actions of an individual. This secret CIA-NSA program, known as MK-Ultra, did not become public knowledge until the mid-1970s, a decade after the program had officially ended. MK-Ultra was the umbrella or overall name for various secret programs, one of which we will tell you more about in a moment. Among the many illegal and secret things the CIA or NSA did was to conduct experiments on mental patients under the guise of treatment. Patients signed a boilerplate form, which gave the hospital they were in permission to run a series of experiments on them, in the hopes that their various ailments might be cured. The patients didn't know that the doctors conducting the experiments were working for the CIA, and that the patients had signed a relatively open-ended agreement that allowed all kinds of so-called treatment. Patients were given electroshock therapy, a common treatment method at the time, only the charge given was many times the amount allowed. These sessions also occurred more regularly than was considered safe. Moreover, they were often conducted while the subjects were under the influence of drugs, especially LSD and the so-called truth serum, sodium pentothal, among others. Hundreds of men and women were subjected to this treatment for several years. Still, neither a cure for their mental illness nor anything useful for United States security was ever found. It's also important to remember that at the time, the CIA was not limited to actions overseas as it is today, partly due to hearings in which the details of MK-Ultra were exposed. In San Francisco and New York in the 1950s and early 1960s, a branch of the MK-Ultra program called Operation Midnight Climax was conducted. In both cities, the CIA purchased or rented houses through its agents that were then bugged with microphones, wiretaps, two-way mirrors, hidden cameras, and hookers. Yes, ordinary men, some of them in city or federal government, were brought to these houses after Christmas parties, or simply after being told of a place they could get lucky. While at these houses, their drinks were spiked with very large amounts of LSD. They were then observed by CIA operatives, most famously a sadistic San Francisco policeman and CIA agent named George White. Over several years, White and others observed men begin to hallucinate, turn incredibly and hostilely paranoid, be unable to perform sexually or overperform for hours, and talk unintelligibly to themselves or others for hours, sometimes days, and more. After years of this, the CIA ended the program, convinced LSD did nothing but turn people into maniacs. George White apparently had fun, for one of the men he dosed with LSD was a former partner who spent weeks holed up in a motel, convinced the entire world was out to get him. It should be remembered that one of the reasons these programs were top secret is because they were illegal. Even before MKUltra, the United States government experimented on U.S. citizens without their knowledge. One of the most insidious was an experiment at the illustrious Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee in the 1940s. In 1993, the Associated Press reported that the U.S. Department of Energy was looking for women that were unwittingly subjected to medical experiments run at a prenatal clinic run by the university. Senator Jim Sasser of Tennessee and famous astronaut-turned-senator John Glenn were both active in uncovering details about the program, which resulted in the cancer deaths of at least 3 children in later life and likely several stillborn deaths. Why did they, and possibly others, die? Because their mothers had signed up for a trial involving the study of iron supplements in pregnancy. Except that the iron tablets taken by the women were not just iron pills. They were pills that might contain iron, but had been irradiated before the women took them. Irradiated means that the pills given to pregnant women were radioactive. Initial investigations in the 1960s claimed that the deaths were no more than the statistical average, but tests conducted in the 1980s concluded that radiation was the culprit in the deaths of an unknown number of children. The AP article, dated December 20th, 1993, can be read on the internet today. The United States, Russia, and numerous other countries have poison gas stockpiles, even if they don't admit it. Both nations have vowed not to use them, but other nations, most notably Syria in recent years, have, and they likely obtained some of their stockpile from Russia. In recent years, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been accused of ordering the poisoning of political opponents at home, in Ukraine, and in Great Britain. That's not surprising, knowing what we know of the man who rose to power after a long stint in the dreaded Soviet secret police, the KGB. However, the Soviets and/or the Russians' history of experimentation with poison gas and biological weapons goes back to 1921, when the Communists finally defeated their enemies in the Russian Civil War. A secret facility inside Russia, at times known by various names like the Chamber, Lab X, the Special Room, etc., was created. It primarily focused on creating a deadly substance that was tasteless, odorless, and most importantly, invisible on autopsies, ensuring the cause of the victim's death would remain a mystery. Though it's unclear whether they ever created such a substance, scientists at the Chamber reportedly created a gaseous version of cyanide that could be dispersed over a wide area, and hard-to-detect poisons that simulated a heart attack. By the way, cyanide smells like almonds. In 2018, The Guardian newspaper reported that Lab X was still functioning, and had even been kept secret from reforming Premier Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s, for fear he would end the program. Moreover, The paper reported that several dissidents, rival politicians, and other enemies of the state had been killed in one way, shape, or form by substances created in the special room. We hope you found these topics as interesting as we do. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification button to find out when our new content is online. Thank you.